There are all sorts of things to discover. You may even find a lonely man who will give you a unique item for free. Each endgame mechanic needs to have a pinnacle endgame encounter. The most difficult content in Path of Exile 2.
I've covered some of the PoE2 keystones in videos about their particular section on the tree, but not all of them. So this video will serve as a full overview of every keystone that will be on the tree for PoE2's early access launch, showing where they're located and discussing exactly how they work. So here we are on the footage that I recorded in my playtime in Los Angeles, and we're beginning with Resolute Technique, which is unchanged from Path of Exile 1. Your hits can't be evaded, never deal critical strikes. This keystone makes it so that the accuracy hit check calculation is bypassed because the enemy cannot evade your attacks. As long as the attack makes contact, it will hit, but at the cost of preventing you from dealing any critical strikes. Blood magic has changed a little bit, and it's also moved quite significantly on the tree, now finding itself at an equal distance from the strength and strength int starting locations. This one removes all of your mana and makes skills cost life instead of mana. It doesn't grant 10% more life like it does in PoE 1. This one is very interesting considering that all characters will now have their entire mana pool, as reservations now use spirit instead of mana. It's hard to say exactly how useful blood magic will be without knowing how difficult it is to manage standard mana skill costs in the endgame. Next up we have Avatar of Fire, which has slightly moved towards the outer side of the tree but remains in the strength aligned area. Avatar of Fire has changed a bit from PoE 1, making 75% of all damage types be converted to fire while preventing you from dealing any non-fire damage. This means that it will also convert chaos damage too, which is new in PoE 2. We know that damage conversion scales differently in PoE 2. You can only scale the portion of converted damage with modifiers that affect fire damage dealt. The downside modifier of preventing non-fire damage on this keystone means that you'll need to find the remaining 25% conversion before you take the keystone to prevent losing a chunk of damage. But overall, this keystone has a lot of potential to completely convert any damage type over to fire and allow abilities to be played in completely different builds. Giant's Blood has been a fan favourite since the moment it was leaked from the Tokyo Game Show a few months back, and we're finally able to get the confirmed wording on this one. You can wield two-handed axes, maces and swords in one hand. Double attribute requirements of weapons. So this keystone is confirmed to not double the level requirement of two-handed weapons, as I had speculated may be the case in previous videos, and you can dual wield two-handed weapons. But to do so, you'll need a mammoth amount of attributes, particularly strength. This keystone is such a fun one, and it's hard to say how strong this is without knowing how accessible attributes will be, or how high the standard attribute requirements are on the top tier two-handed weapons. But if PoE 1 is anything to go by, you may need somewhere in the region of 850 strength if you want to dual wield the highest level two-hand maces. That's a lot of strength, but there is a very big difference in what is gained from attributes going into PoE 2, where you not only gain a lot more life from strength, but you also have extremely limited life scaling on the passive skill tree, making this investment into strength a lot more useful than just satisfying the Giant's Blood requirements. I expect to see some fun builds using this one. Next up we have Unwavering Stance, which has moved a little bit closer to the edge of the tree. This is a really interesting keystone with a massive trade-off. You can no longer make use of the dodge roll, but your stun threshold is doubled. Now, from everything we know about PoE2's endgame bosses, the dodge roll is going to be an extremely important factor in staying alive. But this keystone seems to suggest that it may be possible to tank some of those very dangerous abilities given the correct setup. Stun threshold is based on a character's maximum life, so this keystone naturally pairs well with a character that is investing a lot into life scaling, such as one using the aforementioned Giant's Blood keystone. We're also not sure just yet how difficult it will be to invest into defense against stuns. We don't know if stun immunity will even exist. Bulwark's location is exactly opposite Unwavering Stance, which is fitting considering it also modifies the dodge roll, but these two keystones can't be used together. Instead of disabling the dodge roll, Bulwark makes it so that you lose your avoidance frames at the beginning of the dodge roll and you'll no longer avoid those incoming projectiles or strikes. In return, you'll take 30% less damage while dodge rolling. Okay, this one actually seems to be very good for a few reasons. One is the location on the tree. Many builds here will have good life scaling and decent recovery, which pairs well with consistent mitigation. But something really important to mention about Bulwark is that the 30% less damage from hits should be present for the full duration of the dodge roll, not just the avoidance part of the roll towards the beginning. Add to that the fact that this keystone makes it so that your dodge roll can now be used to help mitigate the damage of any incoming area of effect hits that previously couldn't be avoided with a dodge roll, and I can actually see this keystone being picked up quite a bit. Iron Reflexes is unchanged from PoE1 and finds itself in a very similar place on the passive skill tree as well. This one converts all of your evasion rating into armor, preventing you from evading but improving mitigation against physical hits. However, there is something important to mention here about conversion in PoE2. We know that damage conversion will work differently, in that it will no longer remember its origin types and therefore will only scale with modifiers that affect the end type. One would assume that the same conversion system would exist across all mechanics in the game, and that would mean that the portion of armor you gain from converted evasion wouldn't scale from any increased evasion modifiers, and would instead only be affected by modifiers that would affect armor. Glancing Blows has moved all the way to the lower side of the tree and has been restored to its original pre-nerf state. Block chance is doubled, but you take 50% of damage from blocked hits. By default, a blocked hit does no damage, but this keystone will help in being able to more consistently block incoming hits thanks to having a higher block chance, at the cost of now taking half of the damage from those hits. But there's something important to be mentioned with Glancing Blows, and that's the new active block mechanic in PoE2. If you're using active block, you probably don't want to use Glancing Blows, because this keystone will make you take 50% of the damage of incoming hits, even though you already have a 100% chance to block hits from the front during the Raise Shield animation. With that said, however, Glancing Blows is still a great keystone to boost passive block gained from your shield or other stats. And keep in mind that a blocked hit also prevents any on-hit effects such as ailment application, even if that hit deals damage due to Glancing Blows. The true power of Glancing Blows though has always been when it's combined with recovery on block, so we'll have to wait and see if those kinds of modifiers exist in PoE2. Next up we have Oasis, which finds itself in the middle of the Strength, Dex and Dexterity starting areas. This keystone prevents the use of charms but grants more recovery from flasks. Now, charms are a new equipment slot which functions in a very similar way to flasks, using charges to automatically activate on a certain condition, such as taking cold damage. Importantly, charms can also be used to help solve ailments like bleeding or freeze, activating upon receiving the ailment to immediately remove that ailment. This keystone prevents their use entirely, and I'm not convinced that the upside is strong enough to justify it. One consideration here may be mana flasks, as we know that Mind Over Matter has a lot of potential, but the location on the tree for Oasis doesn't lend itself well in a Mind Over Matter build. Vaal Pact finds itself moved towards the left side of the bottom of the tree, and it now makes all Life Leech instant but prevents the use of Life Flasks. We know that Leech is being simplified in PoE2 to always leech a percentage of damage dealt, whilst the limiting factor will now be how much leech resistance a monster has. Instant Life Leech will still be a very strong modifier to have, but the trade-off here is that you need to kind of always be dealing damage in order to recover that life, as you won't be able to use your Life Flask in situations where you're required to stop attacking and move out of the way. One notable change from PoE1's version of this keystone is that life regeneration is still in play for the character, so it's possible that you could forego the Life Flask entirely and just focus on Life Leech and life regeneration as your sources of recovery. Elemental Equilibrium is similar to PoE1's version, but instead requires a specific damage type to then inflict the correct exposure. If you deal fire damage, you'll remove fire exposure and inflict lightning exposure. Cold damage will remove cold exposure and inflict fire exposure, while lightning damage removes lightning exposure and inflicts cold exposure. An important note here is that it looks like this keystone will no longer provide a larger exposure than other standard applications, and it will likely inflict a 10% exposure as long as that remains the default exposure applied by non-specified sources. This keystone will be very strong if you're able to inflict ignites with cold damage, if something like the Elementalist exists in PoE2. Heartstopper has moved to the middle between the Dex and Dex int start locations, and it's been changed quite significantly. It now lessens damage over time taken by 75% if you've started taking damage over time in the past second, but makes it so that you take 50% more damage over time if you haven't started taking damage over time in the past second. The use of this keystone will reward fast response times to moving out of damaging areas or cleansing damaging ailments, to ensure that you're never taking damage over time for longer than a second, preventing the downside modifier from proccing. Remember that this keystone doesn't track each damage over time instant separately, and instead just checks if you're taking any sources of damage over time. For example, let's say you get inflicted by a bleed which barely deals any damage to you but lingers on you for a long while. If you step into a damage over time ground effect and the bleed has been on you for longer than a second, that means you're no longer considered to have started taking damage over time in the past second, and you now have the downside modifier active on you, and you'll be taking 50% more damage over time from all sources, including both the bleed and the ground door. The upside of this keystone is incredibly powerful, but the downside is equally as devastating if you fail to notice a damage over time effect on you, so you need to be very careful when using this one. Next is Acrobatics, which also finds itself between the Dex and Dex int starting locations, right on the outside of the tree. Acrobatics changes the type of hits that you can evade, from being just projectiles and strikes, to now also including previously unevadable area of effect hits, but it does so at the cost of causing you to lose half of your evasion rating. The downside of this keystone is absolutely brutal, but its effectiveness really relies on how much evasion a character is reasonably expected to obtain. This keystone is likely to be very powerful in boss fight situations where you now have the chance to evade powerful slams, and a lot less powerful in a standard mapping setup, as in those situations, your evade chance will be much lower against far more incoming hits. Eternal Youth finds itself moved all the way across the other side of the passive tree, in the middle of the Dex int aligned portion of the tree. This one makes recharge from the energy shield mechanic apply to life instead, while making life flasks recover energy shield instead. Now this can be quite a powerful keystone if the mechanics of life recharge function as they do in PoE1. Taking damage to energy shield while Eternal Youth is allocated in PoE1 will not stop or prevent life recharge from starting, and if this function still exists in PoE2, using your life flask to keep your ES topped off to always buy time for life recharge to begin could be quite strong. However, do keep in mind that energy shield's base delay before recharge begins is 4 seconds in PoE2, up from 2 seconds in PoE1, but you can of course still invest into modifiers to speed this up. Chaos Inoculation finds itself in the same location in PoE2 as it was in PoE1, and it also does exactly the same thing. Your maximum life becomes 1 and you're immune to chaos damage. In PoE2, a hit that would cause bleeding must deal damage to life to inflict that ailment, which means a character using Chaos Inoculation is effectively immune to bleeding. Chaos damage also removes twice as much energy shield by default instead of bypassing it in PoE2, but CI makes you immune to this damage type, completely negating that downside. At the same time, Poison bypasses energy shield by default in PoE2, but since Poison deals chaos damage, that also won't be an issue for a character using CI. Depending on what gear is accessible and if there's any powerful ascendancies that lend themselves well to making use of CI, such as the PoE1's Trickster, this keystone has a lot of potential to be really strong. Resonance is located close by and changes the types of charges you gain by changing one out for another. Power charges are gained instead of frenzy charges, frenzies instead of endurance charges, and endurance charges instead of power charges. This one will be one of those keystones which immediately enables a build or two in allowing you to gain a type of charge and spend that charge in a build that previously had a hard time in doing so. Keep in mind that charges in PoE2 do not grant any inherent stats, and are used exclusively to empower ability usage. Speaking of charges, Conduit is located in the middle of the int and dex in starting locations and makes any charges you gain be gained by allies in your presence instead. Because charges no longer grant stats, this one is unlikely to be useful for any minion builds and is instead targeted at group play, allowing for a character to generate charges for their party members to quickly spend on powerful abilities. Eldritch Battery is in a very similar place to its location in PoE1, but its modifiers are massively changed. This keystone will now convert all of your energy shield into mana. That is wild. We know that in PoE2, mana is going to be much more of an interesting mechanic on the average build, as all characters will have access to their full mana pool to make use of unless they're using blood magic. Eldritch Battery is going to be a way for characters to gain incredible amounts of mana, which will be particularly useful with Mind Over Matter, which now makes 100% of damage be taken from mana before life. There's potential here for a character to use this keystone together with Chaos Inoculation and Mind Over Matter and completely focus on building a giant mana pool and having a large amount of mana sustain, as mana then becomes their only hit pool. However, just like with Iron Reflexes, it's important to mention the change to conversion. If non-damage conversion follows the same formula as damage conversion, the portion of energy shield converted to mana will not scale with any modifiers to energy shield, and will instead only scale with modifiers that would affect mana. Whispers of Doom now moves more towards the top middle of the tree and is now a keystone, providing the additional curse but doubling the standard curse activation delay. We know that curses in PoE2 will have an activation delay after they've been cast before they take effect. This keystone is very strong if you're able to apply curses using another method, such as with Blasphemy or Hand of Chayula, to fully bypass the downside. Necromantic Talisman is essentially the same as Necromantic Aegis from PoE1, only it makes your amulet apply to your minions instead of your shield. We don't know too much about amulet modifiers in PoE2 or whether there are any interesting unique amulets to pair with this keystone, but the loss of the amulet slot in the context of PoE1 is quite significant in terms of scaling minion damage, so we'll need to wait and see what's available for this keystone. Ancestral Bond will completely remove the totem limit and make the only restricting factor for placing totems the amount of spirit you're able to acquire. Each totem place will reserve 100 spirit while it's active, which is around the same amount of base spirit that an automated meta gem will reserve. We don't really know much about totems other than the few attack totems we've seen. The interesting thing about the attack totems we've seen so far, both Shockwave Totem and Ancestral Warrior Totem, is that they both have their own base damage rather than using your weapon, which means you could theoretically use a one-handed mace and a scepter in your offhand for spirit gain to help enable this keystone. Mind Over Matter is pretty much located exactly where it was in PoE1, but it now makes all damage be taken from mana before life, essentially making your mana pool your primary focus for scaling EHP. The downside of 50% less mana recovery is very significant, however, as this affects all forms of recovery over time, including regeneration, leech, and mana flask usage, unless it's instant. This new version of Mind Over Matter unlocks some synergy with the new Eldritch Battery and with Chaos Inoculation, a combo which previously didn't function together. Zealot's Oath also has significant changes. This keystone now makes excess life recovery from regeneration apply to energy shield, whilst preventing energy shield from recharging. What exactly is excess life recovery from regeneration? Well, this is likely to mean any time your life is full, your life regeneration is instead put to work to recover your energy shield. This is quite a powerful keystone for builds which have some energy shield but are also consistently in the thick of battle, such as a melee warrior who's unlikely to be buying enough time for their energy shield recharge to begin naturally. However, it's important to note that the actual amount of life recovery is applied to energy shield, not the modifiers themselves, meaning percentage-based life regeneration modifiers will still scale from your life, making this keystone considerably weaker in combination with Chaos Inoculation, outside of the use of flat regen modifiers. It also has significant synergy with the new Eternal Youth, as the downside of Zealot's Oath specifically prevents energy shield from recharging, but Eternal Youth makes life recharge instead, bypassing this downside. Lastly, Pain Attunement has moved far from the top right area to the outside of the Strength Int aligned area. Its modifiers are also massively changed. It now makes characters have 30% more critical damage bonus while on low life, but a 30% less critical damage bonus while on full life. We're not sure yet if abilities such as Petrified Blood will exist in PoE2, so the usefulness of this keystone will rely on mechanics that can force a character to be on low life, or to be considered to be on low life, to activate this upside. And there you have it, every keystone in Path of Exile 2's early access build of the game. There's some really interesting ones in there and some big changes from PoE1 as well. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.